Imagine a plan to merge two trucking companies into one larger carrier in 1940. To do so meant submitting a finance application to the Interstate Commerce Commission, appearing at a hearing, and presenting your case as to why it would be worth operationally and financially. In most cases, the ICC would approve the application, especially if the target carrier was in financial trouble. From the start of the trucking industry being regulated by the Interstate Commerce Commission, trucking companies were used to growing by merger. Hearings for finance applications had become as common as hearings to be granted a certificate of operating authority. By the time 1940 rolled around, in just 5 years, the number of finance applications reached over 1,200. Then, in mid-1940, something happened that had never been attempted in the trucking industry, a plan so big that there was no precedent to fall back on, a scheme that was so enormous that it would eventually require 3 separate finance applications before the ICC. That in itself was not unusual, as one carrier might have merger plans to separately take over 3 smaller carriers. But this combined with the 3 finance applications would create one gigantic carrier holding company from 36 small and regional motor carriers. 36, something never attempted before. Trucking regulations started just 5 years before, and it had come to this: a plan that would have one holding company controlling 36 truck lines. During the first day of the hearing, they talked a lot about competition and whether the companies involved in the merger would be eliminating competition or if there were enough companies that would survive if all these companies were gobbled up. According to the Interstate Commerce Commission motor carrier reports, 1939 revenues of the companies that were to be involved in the merger totaled $10,683,000. 1939 revenues of all the companies, Class 1 carriers, that would still survive and without the merger or not involved with the merger, all of those combined had revenues of $12,359,000, more than the carriers that would be involved. And some of the carriers that competed against the ones that were going to be gobbled up, or hopefully, check out this list. Lewis and Holmes Motor Freight Corporation. They were based in High Point, North Carolina, operated basically from High Point to Atlanta. Colonial Motor Freight Line, another High Point, North Carolina carrier. Cochran Transportation Company out of Richmond. Central Motor Lines out of Charlotte. Burlington Truckers, Baltimore Transfer. Acres Motor Lines of Gastonia, North Carolina. Miller Motor Express of Charlotte. Mason and Dixon Lines. Modern Transfer Company. Motor Transit Company. New South Express Lines. Overnight Motor Transportation Company. Preston Trucking. RC Motor Lines. Roadway Express. Tidewater Express. Thurston Motor Lines. Wilson Freight Forwarding. And in some of the traffic lanes that were important of the southern carriers going up to New York, check this out. From Atlanta to Charlotte, the ones that were going to be involved in the merger with Atlantic States Motor Lines, Horton, and Transportation Incorporated. The 3 major competitors to them in the same Atlanta to Charlotte traffic lane: Acres Motor Lines, Lewis and Holmes Motor Freight, Miller Motor Express. Let's take it one step further. Between Atlanta and New York, you had Atlantic States and Horton that were going to be proposed in a merger. In the same Atlanta, New York traffic lane, you had Acres, Mason and Dixon, and Roadway as the major competitors. One more. Richmond to Washington. You had most of the carriers involved in a merger: Atlantic States, Barnwell, Brooks, Horton, Mundy, and the Right Line. Those not involved that were competitors: Baltimore Transfer, Cochrane Transportation, Colonial Motor Freight Line, East Coast Freight Line, Mason Dixon, Overnight, Preston, RC, Roadway, and Wilson. So these are the things that were brought out when they were talking about how competition would fare if this merger was approved. I just found that very interesting.
Chapter 1. The first financial application. In early May 1940, finance application number F-1223 was submitted to the Interstate Commerce Commission. It was from a newly created corporation named the Transport Company of New York City.
In the application, the Transport Company filed for ICC approval to control 12 motor carriers by stock ownership and outright purchase another trucking company. Some of the ones to be under control would be Aero Carrier Corporation, York Motor Express Company, Kirby and Kirby Incorporated, Mundy Motor Lines, Consolidated Motor Lines, Motor Haulage Company, and Brooks Transportation Company Incorporated. Proposed to be acquired outright was Super Service Freight Company. The acquisition involved an outlay of more than $4 million cash for stock in the companies and nearly $1 million in stock of the transport company. What were these companies and why were they selected? Well, let's look at each one for details on where. Aero Carrier Corporation was headquartered in Paterson, New Jersey, and operated over irregular routes between points within a 35-mile radius of New York City and regular routes to cities of Binghamton, New York, Trenton, New Jersey, and Allentown, Pennsylvania. A large amount of its traffic moved between the New York City metropolitan area and an area within a 40-mile radius of Allentown. The original contract for the purchase of Aero stock was dated May 2, 1940, and amended on September 23, 1940. The amended agreement obligated the transport company to purchase Aero stock. The idea was that regardless of what the ICC decided with the other carriers, that transport company would purchase Aero anyway, hoping the ICC would allow all merger approvals or just one. The Aero Carrier Corporation would become part of the transport company. Risky? Yes, but it was a solid plan to ensure buying at least one carrier and then come back later to get ICC approval for others. With at least one merger candidate, it could be the start of a much bigger trucking empire. Another company to take ownership of in the plan was York Motor Express Company, along with a related firm called RF Terminal and Warehousing Company, which owns 3 terminals that was leased to York. The motor carrier operated over regular routes between Washington, D.C. and New York City, between Baltimore, Maryland and Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and between Harrisburg and New York. The company also had intrastate rights in Pennsylvania and moved truckloads of automobile tire chains between York, Pennsylvania and Bridgeport, Connecticut. Mundy Motor Lines was another potential takeover target on the list of carriers the transport company sought to own by stock ownership. Based in Roanoke, Virginia, the company also controlled Mundy Brothers Transportation Corporation, which operated over irregular routes within a radius of 100 miles of Roanoke, Virginia. The Motor Lines Common Carrier had operating authority over several regular routes between Johnson City, Tennessee, Bristol, Virginia, and Charlotte, North Carolina on the south side, and New York City on the north, serving the principal cities of Roanoke, Lynchburg, and Winchester, Virginia, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Maryland, Wilmington, Delaware, Harrisburg, Allentown, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Trenton and Paterson, New Jersey. Notice how some of the cities are served by the other two common carriers already mentioned. Paterson, New Jersey, served by Arrow Carrier and Mundy. York Motor Express and Mundy both provided service to Washington, Harrisburg, and Philadelphia. Mundy also had intrastate rights in Virginia, with routes between Staunton and Roanoke, Lynchburg, and Danville. Let's look at a smaller company that the Transport Corporation sought ownership of. That would have been Kirby and Kirby Incorporated. Kirby and Kirby had routes between Newcastle and Wilmington, Delaware, northward to Trenton, New Jersey, New York, and Waterbury, Connecticut. It also transported iron and steel products from Trenton to all Pennsylvania and West Virginia points. The largest company listed on the financial application was Consolidated Motor Lines and 3 affiliated firms. The carrier had a network of routes covering practically the entire state of Massachusetts, served 50% of the towns and 90% of the population of Connecticut, as well as a large portion of Rhode Island. Consolidated had routes from Boston, Massachusetts, westward to Buffalo, New York, and from Buffalo to Philadelphia, carving most of the areas in between. Consolidated had a rich history of growth and played a vital role in trucking history. It grew by swallowing up other carriers until it was one of the largest trucking companies in New England. It was the brainchild of a father and son team with the surname Arbor. Joseph Arbor began his career in 1907 with one horse and a converted fire wagon. He began hauling freight from the New Britain, Connecticut railroad station to local factories. Later, he bought another wagon and 2 more horses. In 1911, he made his first merger by buying the business of John Halverson. In 1914, Joseph Arbor bought his first motor truck. His only experience with motorized transportation occurred during the era of solid rubber tires, trucks with no windshields, and a maximum speed of 15 miles per hour over roads filled with mud, ruts, and holes. His son Everett Arbor joined the firm in 1916, and the name of the business was changed to J. Arbor and Son. Once his son Everett joined the business, Joseph Arbor went to work creating one motor carrier that would become the largest in New England. In 1927, new terminals were opened in New Haven and Bridgeport, Connecticut. A year later, his fledgling company was up to 25 trucks in the fleet. Also in 1928, Joseph Arbor made his first acquisition to expand his territory. Harold C. Davis was operating new routes northward from New Britain to Hartford, Springfield, and Boston. Calculated planning called for merging the 2 freight lines together. The former Davis routes would remain as they were, with the Arbor side of the combination transporting freight south to New York City. Once his son Everett joined the business, Joseph Arbor went to work creating one motor carrier that would become the largest in New England. In 1927, new terminals were opened in New Haven and Bridgeport, Connecticut. A year later, his fledgling company was up to 25 trucks in the fleet. Also in 1928, Joseph Arbor made his first acquisition to expand his territory. Harold C. Davis was operating routes northward from New Britain to Hartford, Springfield, and Boston. Calculated planning called for merging the two freight lines together. The former Davis routes would remain as they were, and the Arbor side of the combination transporting freight south to New York City. Continuing to grow by acquiring other companies could have either strained resources or bolstered finances by finding additional shippers as expansion into other cities took place. Joseph Arbor was smart, calculated, and determined. In April 1929, the first of two major changes were made that would solidify his trucking company as a strong, formidable carrier in the Northeast. United Arbor Express Company, organized as a consolidation of Joseph Arbor and Son and United Motor Lines of Hartford, Connecticut. Both firms were running regular routes from New Britain and Hartford to New York. The new carrier had 130 trucks in the fleet and would soon create more routes. Because of combining the two firms together, there was a change in top management. Harold Davis, whose trucking enterprise was taken over in 1928, became president. Joseph Arbor was vice president. His son Everett was treasurer, and Oscar Bylander became secretary. The consolidation was the first step in a movement towards uniting all New England motor freight lines for faster, more economical, and more systematic service. The trucks would be operated on a schedule similar to a railroad schedule. The equipment of the combined operation now totaled more than 150 trucks, with the Joseph Arbor side having 52 of that number. The newly acquired United Motor Lines Company also controlled subsidiaries. United had 27 trucks, Motor Transport Company of Bridgeport, Connecticut, and Standard Truckers of New Haven had an additional 70 trucks, bringing the entire fleet up to 150. To further unite more New England freight lines under the umbrella of the Joseph Arbor organization would mean additional acquisitions. In November 1930, the next step would be accomplished. The merger of United Arbor Express and Woodland Transportation Company also meant another name change for the company. A new name that would signify the ambitions of the organization. One name that would consolidate all the operations into one. In November 1930, the name was made official as Consolidated Motor Lines, Incorporated. Chapter 2. Growing the Consolidated Empire. The New England motor carrier industry was rapidly changing at the end of 1930. Joseph Arbor had more changes, and the next few years would see Consolidated Motor Lines expand outward from New England. However, Arbor wasn't finished yet. He still had more to do. In 1932, several strategic moves, one unexpected, would enable additional growth. The unexpected came as a competitor died and his company became available. In March 1932, Consolidated took over Bill Nealon Motor Express, which was a large company in itself. With the routes of Bill Nealon Motor Express added, the trucks of Consolidated were able to go south as far as Philadelphia. With the growth came duplicate terminals in several cities, and decisions were made to keep those facilities that were the largest and provided opportunities for growth of the company. By 1935, Consolidated had 300 trucks. and just 2 years later that number doubled to 600. Two more carriers were absorbed: Reliable Transportation Company of Bridgeport, Connecticut, and Simpson Transportation Lines. With the Simpson routes consolidated, now hauled freight to the other side of New York State, all the way to Buffalo. By the time 1940 rolled around, Consolidated had 1,500 employees. The operations were in 6 states with 79 terminals and call stations, which were local phone numbers in cities away from the local phone calls of terminals. Invaluable to shippers and beginning to be used by motor carriers across the country. There were 2 other carriers on the application that the transport company wished to acquire through stock ownership. One was Motor Haulage, a small carrier with service within a 60-mile radius of New York City. The other one was Brooks Transportation Company, Inc., a regular route carrier out of Richmond, Virginia, with operations as far south as Greenville, South Carolina, north to New York City. Super Service Freight was desired as an outright purchase. All terminals, rolling stock, everything. Another regular route carrier between Chicago and Knoxville, Tennessee, up to Philadelphia and Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Chapter 3. Another week, another application. Within days of the first financial application being submitted to the Interstate Commerce Commission, another application was sent in by the Transport Company of New York. This finance application was number F-1244, and this particular one sought control of 8 carriers. Horton Motor Lines Incorporated of Charlotte, North Carolina, Barnwell Brothers Incorporated of Burlington, North Carolina, Transportation Incorporated of Atlanta, Georgia, Rutherford Freight Lines of Bristol, Tennessee, Miller Transport of Philadelphia, New York and New Brunswick Auto Express Company of New Brunswick, New Jersey, Friedman Motor Service, also of New Brunswick, and Niagara Motor Express of Cleveland, Ohio. Horton, Barnwell Brothers, and Transportation Incorporated would be a part of trucking history again in a few short years. Those 3 motor carriers would be an integral part of creating a big freight enterprise, not on the scale of this that was proposed with these 3 applications talked about here. Horton and Barnwell Brothers served practically the same areas, from the Carolinas to New York and Pennsylvania. Transportation Incorporated interchanged freight destined for New York frequently with Barnwell Brothers at Burlington, North Carolina. Rutherford Freight Lines was similar to Super Service, as their routes run between Chattanooga and Knoxville, Tennessee, but are more extensive in Virginia across to Norfolk. Miller Transport had more operations as a contract carrier in New York, New Jersey, and parts of Pennsylvania. Chapter 4. The third financial application. 1 month and 4 days after submitting the first financial application, the Transport Company of New York submitted a third one. This one was number F-1264, and 16 companies were targeted. On this application were trucking companies as usual: M. Transportation Lines of Buffalo, New York, Davidson Transfer and Storage Company of Baltimore, M&M Transportation Company, Middlesex Transportation Company, Smith and Solomon Trucking Company, Wright Line, Hampton Roads Transportation, Shines Express, McCarthy Freight System, Pyramid Motor Freight, Southeastern Motor Lines, Atlantic States Motor Lines, and Branch Motor Express Company. Yes, the same Branch Motor Express Company that years later, as an independent company, went on their own buying spree. So there should be a hint. even though they were listed on the application, doesn't mean that they were acquired. There were other companies listed on the application, ones that the transport company wanted to buy ownership of. The difference was some of the companies were not trucking lines. One was Yellow Truck and Coach Manufacturing Company, a subsidiary of General Motors, not a truck carrier hauling freight. This was a truck manufacturer, making the trucks that could be used by the truck carriers. Many would have thought controlling a truck manufacturer was a far-fetched idea. In a previous application, the transport company sought to acquire Horton Motor Lines, which had its own truck and trailer subsidiary named Brown Equipment and Manufacturing Company. Brown not only made equipment for Horton, but also for other companies. Along with the Yellow Truck and Manufacturing Company came Hertz Drive Yourself System, renting and leasing cars and trucks from company-owned locations across the country. The name, the Transport Company of New York, was taking on a new meaning. Its future was planned to be involved in every facet of motor transportation. If all the companies listed on the 3 acquisitions were approved by the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Transport Company of New York would control almost 40 motor carriers from New Orleans up to Boston and New England and across to western Pennsylvania and New York State. There would be enormous duplicate routes, dozens of cities with multiple terminals to be consolidated, and maintenance concerns with so many different truck makes and models to be kept in operating condition. Of the list of the top 122 Class 1 motor carriers for 1939, 14 of them would be controlled by one company. Those 14 carriers had combined revenue of $26,153,000. That's almost 4 times the revenue of Interstate Motor Freight System, which was the largest motor carrier in the country at the time. Chapter 5. The ICC hearing begins. As per normal practice, each applicant has to appear at a hearing before members of the Interstate Commerce Commission. The purpose of the hearing was to present the case why the Transport Company of New York be allowed to control so many trucking companies at one time. Also at the hearing would be any protesting company to attempt to sway the ICC to deny 1, 2, or all 3 financial applications. For the past few years, most hearings would have been with joint boards created by the ICC, which were men from local states that were familiar with the trucking industry in their individual localities. This hearing was different due to the number and size of the companies being considered. This hearing would be held in the largest auditorium the ICC could find. And to make certain things run along smoothly, the man in charge would be J. Edward Davey, Chief of the Section of Finance of the ICC Bureau of Motor Carriers. You can't get much higher than that. The hearing began July 15, 1940. Almost immediately, the scope of what the Transport Company of New York became known. The idea was set forth that the aim was to bring about a merger into single ownership, which would be converted from a holding company with many subsidiaries into a vast operating company of one enormous motor carrier. In the testimony given the first day, the motor carriers in the affected areas that were not part of the acquisition voiced concerns about the size and scope of the mega system proposed. Questions about competition were expressed. At the end of the hearings, it was found that the consummation of the proposed acquisitions would not result in undue restraint of competition. In New England, Consolidated Motor Lines and McCarthy Freight System were competitive throughout Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. M&M Transportation was a very strong competitor to Consolidated, and the proposed common control would eliminate all competition between all three carriers. Among the remaining New England carriers, the largest were New England Transportation Company of New Haven, Connecticut, Seaboard Freight Lines of New York City, and Adley Express Company based in New Haven, Connecticut. Between Boston and Providence, Rhode Island, there were 46 motor carriers providing service, 41 between Boston and Springfield, Massachusetts, and 35 between Boston and New York City. In New York State, the following largest trucking companies in the state were Interstate Motor Freight System, Keyshan Motor Express, and Trans-American Freight Lines. Between New York City and Albany, there were 38 carriers authorized to that route, 22 between Albany and Elmira, and 21 between Albany and Buffalo. A discussion was made at the hearing about competition between New York City and Washington, D.C. Most of the discussion related to 47 carriers operating between New York and Philadelphia, and 12 between Philadelphia and Washington. The service to those cities is performed by many carriers in the southern states, connecting New York and Philadelphia to Greensboro, Charlotte, Greenville, South Carolina, and Atlanta, Georgia. At the completion of the hearings, the ICC examiners conducting the hearing made their recommendation. The recommendations were believed to be favorable and were listed in 5 notes. Number 1, the acquisition of control of Aero Carrier, Atlantic States, Barnwell Brothers, Brooks, Consolidated, Davidson, Hampton Roads, Wright Line, Kirby and Kirby, M&M, McCarthy, Mundy, Niagara, Pyramid, Rutherford, Shines, Smith & Solomon, Southeastern, Transportation Incorporated, and York Motor Express. Approved and authorized. Number 2, purchase of Super Service Motor Freight. Approved. Number 3, control of Branch Motor Express, Freedman Motor Service, Miller Transports, Motor Haulage, New York and New Brunswick, and United Arbor Express. Denied. Number 5, control of all the carrier-owned real estate subsidiaries, truck and trailer manufacturing subsidiaries, and the Hertz Drive-It-Yourself companies dismissed. However, the full decision of the ICC had not been rendered yet. What had occurred was merely a recommendation. The final decision came on November 15, 1940. The applications to purchase and take control of all the motor carriers was denied as not being consistent with the public interest. As far as the other companies, those too were dismissed. The conclusions were different from those of the examiner at the hearings. The idea of the Transport Company of New York failed. What would happen next? March 20th, 1942, the ICC granted Associated Transport Incorporated permission to acquire 8 trucking companies, all of them part of the previous scheme presented by the Transport Company of New York just 2 years before. Those 8 trucking companies were Arrow Carrier Corporation, Barnwell Brothers, Consolidated Motor Lines, Horton Motor Lines, McCarthy Freight System, M. Moran Transportation Lines, Southeastern Motor Lines, and Transportation Incorporated. The Justice Department Antitrust Division opposed the application, contending the merger would restrain competition in the motor carrier industry. The ICC said it would not. In authorizing the transaction, the ICC commented, and I quote, "Consolidation of these carriers into one unit would present many opportunities for greater economy and efficiency of operations. It would permit more efficient and greater utilization of equipment and corresponding reduction in consumption of motor fuel and tires. Many carriers are now finding it difficult to provide adequate equipment to meet the needs of the shipping public." End quote. The ICC approval came in late March 1942. It took months to consolidate the motor carriers that Associated Transport merged into. In December of that same year, when Associated announced the details of 4 of the companies that would become the Southern Division. They were Horton Motor Lines, Barnwell Brothers, Southeastern Motor Lines, and Transportation Incorporated. Already had lost their corporate identities and were operating as Associated Transport. The others, Consolidated Motor Lines, McCarthy Freight System, and M. Moran Transportation Lines, would consolidate at the end of 1942. The details of how large Associated Transport had become were just now becoming known. 3,500 vehicles, 5,700 employees, 24,000 miles of routes operating in 18 states. Instantly becoming the largest motor carrier in the country. What happened to some of the executives of the merged companies? Most got cushy new positions with Associated Transport. Harold C. Davis of West Hartford, Connecticut, whose own trucking company became part of Consolidated Motor Lines organization, he became Director of Operations for the Northern Division. H.D. Horton, who had founded Horton Motor Lines of Charlotte, North Carolina, became chairman of the board. The 2 Barnwell brothers that ran the big trucking company based out of Burlington, North Carolina, R.W. Barnwell became vice president of the Southern Division, and his brother James was named director of maintenance. J.J. McCarthy, who was chairman of the board and general manager of McCarthy Freight System, he became vice president of the Northern Division. So that completes the story of how Associated Transport Incorporated came to be. From a massive consolidation idea that got turned down by the ICC just 2 years before, and they tried it again with fewer companies, it finally got approved. And it formed instantly the biggest trucking carrier in the nation. Bigger than PIE, bigger than Consolidated Freightways, bigger than Interstate Motor Freight System, bigger than Riss and Company, bigger than all of them, including Keeshan. How long did it last? By the mid-1970s, Associated Transport was bleeding money. They had to be bailed out by Eastern Freightways, whose slogan was "on the ball." They were much smaller than Associated Transport. They couldn't save it. In the mid-1970s, Associated filed bankruptcy, shut down, throwing thousands of people out of work, and creating a massive collection of truck terminals to be used for other things. For instance, the Burlington, North Carolina massive terminal that was along Interstate 85 that was built in the mid-1960s, that became an outlet mall. It's still a retail setting, but it's nowhere near the level of activity when Associated Transport had it. So that's the story. Hope you've enjoyed it. Leave your comments and let me know what you think. See you next time. And if you want to see some of the equipment that Associated Transport operated through the years, look at this video.